The Second World War has come to an end. In the summer of 1945, the Allied powers meet in Potsdam to discuss what is to become of Germany. The German Labour Front, which used to own Volkswagenwerk GmbH, no longer exists. The company has become an asset without an owner. The British military government takes over responsibility on the 5th of June and appropriates the factory, and it sends a young major there to take charge. His name is Ivan Hirst.
I first arrived at Stadt, already called Wolfsburg. The Americans had been there before us and had changed the name. I was a very young man. I was 28 years old. Well, initially, my brief was very simply just to go to Wolfsburg and find a factory and sit on it. I didn't even say it was a Volkswagen factory.
Germany is largely in ruins. Like the other Allied powers, Britain faces the challenge of providing food, housing, heating fuels and clothing to the population of its occupied zone. The British must also decide what to do with the remaining industrial facilities. They take over the administration of the confiscated Volkswagenwerk GmbH as trustees.
There was already a British army presence at Wolfsburg, in the factory. They had the Volkswagen company repairing trucks and some buses which were coming back from the German army and were being overhauled and made ready for issue to the German transport organizations.
The equipment for these workshops is provided by the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, known as REME, a branch of the British Army in charge of maintaining army equipment, which already begins work in Volkswagen's workshops in early June 1945.
The object of that exercise was to get road transport moving in readiness for the coming winter, as everything in Germany was chaotic. The railways were not working properly, the roads were not in good condition, many bridges were out. So the planners had given priority to this operation to get some transport moving, to get food moving and people moving. So the army presence meant there was already contact with the German management of Volkswagen. My first job was to be introduced to the then German factory manager, one Rudolf Bröhrmann, and we had a quick look around the factory. The factory was in a very poor state. About 2/3 of the roof was down. There were big holes in the floor. The production had still been running up to the end of the war. The company had been working on for the aircraft industry, and alongside that they had been making the Kübelwagen, the Volkswagen Jeep. The production of the Kübelwagen, the Jeep type Volkswagen, had continued to the end of the war, not in large volume.
During the war, a considerable number of machines and large amounts of inventory had been moved from the factory to the surrounding region, and these were now brought back little by little. For Ivan Hirst and REME, the question was, could the factory be used more extensively?
Well, happily for Volkswagen, one Colonel Michael McEvoy, at Rhine Army, the British Army headquarters, who was in charge of operations like the one going on at Volkswagen, he went up to Berlin to the motor show at the beginning of 1939, where the Beetle, the Käfer, was first shown to the world. There were prototypes. And he had a ride in one of these, and he remembered the vehicle well. And because one of his detachments was already at Wolfsburg, he went to have a look at the factory, and he thought there was a possibility. When he realized that Volkswagen was working for the British already and was in the British zone, it was he who had the bright idea that if we could get the Volkswagen into production It would provide the transportation which the British urgently needed for administering Germany, the British zone. The British Army had very few light vehicles. Really, the only vehicles we had were 1,500 weight or 1-ton trucks. A few light vehicles, but they'd come all the way up from Normandy and they were about worn out. And defence spending had been cut, so there was no hope of getting any help from Britain. If these cars could be made in Germany, they would be charged to occupation costs. That is, they would be paid for by Germany. There had been a small production of the saloon Käfer, Beetle, at Wolfsburg during the war. Some hundreds had been built, not many. And one of these was at the factory. Don't know who it belonged to or why it was there, but it was there. I had it painted green, like an army vehicle, and sent it to Rhine Army headquarters. And it came back with an order for 20,000 cars, which was a green light for the factory to start. I think the feeling was not never make it, but what a hell of a job in front of us.
As of the 22nd of August 1945, the Volkswagenwerk GmbH has been commissioned to build 20,000 cars for the British military administration. A fortnight later, the volume is doubled to 40,000. Just 6 months after the British take control, the civilian series production of the car that will later become known as the Beetle begins on the 27th of December 1945. Thus, the factory in Wolfsburg becomes the first car plant in Germany to resume production after the war. Despite this, its outlook for the future remains fraught and uncertain.
Volkswagen was in a precarious position. There was a decision taken during the war that all factories built specifically to manufacture war materials would be destroyed at the end of the war. They would be blown up. Other factories which were deemed to be surplus to the new low level of industry being imposed on Germany after the war. Initially, the American Morgenthau plan was for a very low level of industry. That was modified, and Germany was to have a reasonable level of industry. But factories that were not required to meet that level were offered to any country that had been at war with Germany as war reparations. So Volkswagen was theoretically on the reparations list. It was available for anybody who wanted to take it away.
The option of dismantling the factory and selling it off leads to great uncertainty. No one knows whether the factory actually has a future. But for the time being at least, the order to produce 40,000 vehicles means a certain degree of security.
Because it was required for the occupation requirement, a reserve was put on it for 4 years. Nothing would go for 4 years.
As a result of this postponement, the military administration turns its attention to the way the company is organized.
I suggested we should have a British board, equivalent to the German Aufsichtsrat, a supervisory board, where all the Allied interests would meet. So this British board had a chairman. The chair was taken by Radcliffe. Charles Radcliffe I first met about the end of 1945. He was a great man. I liked him a lot. I had a very high regard for Charles Radcliffe, and we became very good friends. He sorted the fools out. He knew what he wanted, and once he got his eye on the target, he went for it. An order for the cars was one thing. To produce them was another matter. First of all, there was the factory to be put in some sort of order to get production started. Another huge problem was the availability of materials, the steel, the textiles, the seats, the batteries, the tires, the glass, as the whole of German industry was virtually knocked out by the end of the war. And we were given a ration of steel and of glass and so on. Not very much, but enough to get production going. The target we asked for and got was 1,000 cars a month.
Aside from procuring materials and fuel for the power plant, another major problem is recruiting a workforce. During the war, forced labourers were made to produce munitions. Once the war ended, they were liberated by the Americans, and most of them returned to their home countries soon afterwards.
At the end of the war, there was a nucleus of German there, but they were mainly tool makers, the fitters and so on, but not production workers or builders for building the factory, repairing the factory buildings. I talked to our manpower division, and they were very happy to receive the call because they had the problem of releasing Germans from prisoner of war camps who had nowhere to go because they come from Eastern Germany or from areas that had been heavily bombed. And so it was arranged that Volkswagenwerk would offer jobs to them, civilian jobs, ordinary wages, at Wolfsburg. Very many of the workers there are still wearing German army uniforms. That's all they had. The fellows on the production lines and the fellows rebuilding the factory buildings, they worked extremely hard in very poor conditions, very little food, no proper housing.
The shortages are ubiquitous. The workers live with their families in cramped wooden shacks, with very basic sanitation, very little in the way of household effects and bedding, and a lack of clothing, heating fuels and food. The people in charge on the German and British side make a huge effort to provide the essentials. Among other things, they grow grain on the factory premises. As early as in the summer of 1945, just a few weeks after taking control, the British military administration appoints a representative for the employees. In October, the first democratic elections for a works council are held. At their first meeting on November the 27th, the 12 elected representatives of the workforce elect Willy Hilgers as their first chairman. The new Works Council is under the supervision of the military government. Its most important task is to ensure that the scant supplies are justly distributed. Among other things, it sets up a social and economic commission and a commission for entertainment and sports. All these contribute to maintaining industrial peace within the company. However, the future of the factory remains uncertain. The economic and social reconstruction of Germany has begun. The Western Allies want it to become a democratic nation. The denazification of the population plays a central role in this process.
During the first year after the war was a process called denazification swept across Germany. At the end of the war, the really bad Nazis, as the Allies termed them, had been moved out. But then came a thorough examination of everybody in any position of importance, no matter what, local government, administration, business, and anybody holding an executive position or even a private secretary had to declare what their connection had been with the Nazi Party.
In view of the large number of people involved and a series of ambiguous assessment criteria, this soon becomes a complicated business. It is not unusual for conflicting instructions and procedures to result in contradictory decisions, sometimes with chaotic consequences.
When a man or a woman had to be dismissed, they were dismissed. And then under the rules, they were allowed to appeal. Many of them were reinstated quickly. Most of the key management positions survived that because there were people from the motor industry in the Volkswagen project before and during the war. They were not politicians. They were not really interested in the Nazi Party. They were interested in production or running a power station. The top man, however, he fell foul of the second wave of denazification and had to go.
This top man is the plant manager Rudolf Bröhrmann. He is replaced in June 1946 by Dr. Hermann Münch, an expert in corporate law, who was an avowed opponent of the Nazi regime. The British appointed him as the chief trustee in February 1946. Hermann Münch is now both the chief trustee and managing director of the Volkswagenwerk GmbH, the head of the executive board, flanked by the commercial director Leonhard Kemmler and the technical director Wilhelm Steinmeier. Their job is to ensure that the required output of 1,000 cars per month is met or, better still, increased. Production had begun the day after Christmas in 1945. 3 months later, in March 1946, Ivan Hirst drives the 1,000th car off the production line during a celebratory ceremony. Another 10 months later, the completion of the 10,000th car provides the backdrop against which the workforce draws attention to its continued precarious shortages. 10,000 cars and an empty stomach, they write on a banner. And there are other adversities to be dealt with too.
Production was reached 1,000 a month by March 1946. The winter of 1946-7 was a particularly severe winter, and that caused a halt to production. The coal supplies coming into the factory power station were frozen up on the canal, and the roof was still not on the press shop, and in the bitterly cold weather, the hydraulics were not working properly. So it was decided to close down. I think it was 2 months of that winter.
When production resumes in the spring of 1947, the optimization measures introduced the year before increasingly begin to show an effect. The close-meshed regimen of quality checks during production allows faults to be identified early on and the implementation of improvements to be scheduled. The Customer Services Department trains German and British garage staff in servicing and repairing the cars. The Technical Department sends out service bulletins. Staff in the factory and in authorized garages is informed of changes in and improvements to the cars. The expansion of the retail network, launched in the autumn of 1946 with the appointment of 10 large and 28 smaller dealerships for the British zone plus Berlin, continues to make progress. The network of dealerships is growing continuously.
It was already becoming clear to those of us on the British side responsible for the factory that the company had a future. There was a huge demand for cars. Volkswagen was virtually the only car in production in Germany. When the production for the Allies was coming to an end, the government in Britain, in London, woke up to the fact that the British taxpayer at home in Britain was paying, through income tax, for imports of foodstuffs into West Germany, into the British zone, and paying in US dollars. The British economy was not in a good shape, and this was quite a burden on Britain. So orders came down to urge German companies to start exporting again, or if they hadn't exported so far, to think about exporting, to earn foreign currency, to pay for the imports. Volkswagen was something of a question mark, because the British industry didn't like the idea of Volkswagen flooding the world markets. But the British Treasury said, no, we need the money, too bad. Volkswagen exports shall go ahead. And a number of countries were knocking on the gate saying, can we have them for export, to take them to Holland, to Denmark, to India, all over the world, really. The man who made the most noise was one Ben Pon and his brother. They had, years before, had the concession for the Opel car in the Netherlands, so they had already a dealer network.
In October 1947, the export of the cars can begin at last.
Pon was able to take the first cars out of Germany, quickly followed by Denmark, Belgium, Switzerland, countries on Germany's borders. We left the choice of the foreign dealerships to the German management because it was they who would have to carry on in the future.
The saloon destined for export is a luxury alternative to Volkswagen's standard model. It comes in a wider range of colours with improved paintwork, chrome-plated bumpers and wheel caps, and higher quality upholstery. Notwithstanding its success at home and abroad, the management and workforce of Volkswagenwerk GmbH continue to struggle with problems in the supply chain. Necessity is the mother of invention, however.
The factory is a big place, and particularly in the earlier days before all the overhead conveyors were installed, great use was made of battery-driven factory runabouts to carry loads of parts about, materials. The batteries were coming to an end of their life, and there were no new batteries available. The German factory manager, Bröman, said, "This is the end, it stops production." I said, "Not in a motor car factory. Make some." So we sketched out a thing on the back of an envelope, being a Beetle chassis with a seat over the rear wheels and a long steering shaft and a flat platform, which got the name Plattenwagen in German, and a number of those were made and used as factory runabouts.
The Dutch Volkswagen importer, Ben Pon, believes that there is a market for this vehicle in his home country too. At first, the idea is not taken seriously, but with time, that changes.
Eventually, that project turned into the van, the transporter, and the minibus variant and so on.
The transporter, Volkswagen Type 2, also becomes a success once production begins in 1950. Meanwhile, the Beetle continues to develop favourably. Whereas some 10,000 cars rolled off the Wolfsburg production line in 1946, 2 years later the number exceeds 19,000. About a quarter of these are destined to go abroad. By this time, the production of spare parts to supply the ever-growing service network has also begun. At the same time, the increasing success leads to a need for extensive optimizations on many different levels: on the production line, in quality assurance, sales and service, and in the organizational structure.
By mid-1947, the company still didn't have legally a future, but we felt that it did have a future, we on the British board. And I remember saying, well, we must get a man to stiffen up our present management, a man from industry. And I had introduced to me a man called Nordhoff, Heinz Nordhoff. I saw that he was a man of some caliber. He replaced the finance division's man as chief executive, 1st January 1948.
Heinrich Nordhoff is just coming up to the age of 49 when he assumes his position in Wolfsburg. He was on the managing board of Adam Opel AG during the war, and in the summer of 1942 he had been put in charge of Opel's lorry factory in Brandenburg, leaving him in the position of a so-called war industry leader, Wehrwirtschaftsführer. With his appointment as managing director of the Volkswagenwerk GmbH, he follows in the footsteps of Dr. Hermann Münch and immediately introduces a new style of leadership.
He was an extremely strange character, Heinz Nordhoff, strange to my eyes anyway. Extremely suave, urbane character. A cat who preferred to walk alone. All decisions were his decisions. And we were polite to each other, friendly, but never close friends. In discussion, I saw that he had a very wide perspective, shall we say. And he knew the industry. And having been with an American company, he had a broader view. He knew the technical side as well as being a businessman. I think that is where I felt that he was the right man for the job. He wasn't simply a businessman. He could get down at the factory level and do something.
3 years after the end of the war, Volkswagen has been transformed from the bombed ruins of an arms factory to a smoothly running car plant. In 1948, 8,700 people have jobs at the Volkswagenwerk GmbH. Their working and living conditions are improving all the time. The country as a whole, however, remains racked by shortages.
By mid-47, the place was pretty well running. But the German economy was still in a hell of a mess because the currency was worthless, the old Reichsmark. In the middle of 1948, the currency was reformed. The Reichsmark was abolished and replaced by the new Deutsche Mark.
The currency reform comes into force in the 3 Western occupied zones on the 20th of June 1948. It ends the long period of makeshift economy and black marketeering.
The effect was unbelievable. Shops which had been empty, the dusty shop windows, suddenly appeared full of goods. Must have been hidden away in the cellar waiting for this to happen. That appeared not only in retail shops but throughout industry, and everything began to move. That was the beginning of the economic miracle of Germany, just by changing the currency.
The shift to an operational goods market creates an entirely new basis for dependable cost calculations and investment planning.
On Volkswagen, well, they were able to get supplies of materials. They were able to sell their cars for a meaningful currency. And everything just dropped into place and began to work. Volkswagen was already there waiting to go. We got a German management in that could do the job. The factory had been largely repaired. The design of the car had been, details had been improved to get the bugs out of it. We had set up a dealer organization and service department.
The strong demand leads to a tremendous boost in growth. Production rises from some 19,000 cars in 1948 to more than 46,000 the following year, and another year on, the volume has reached almost 82,000 saloons and 8,000 transporters. The political development towards democracy is also striding ahead. In May 1949, the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany is proclaimed. This is a key step towards founding a new democratic country on the territory of the Western occupied zones. At the same time, it marks a turning point, after which the Allied powers withdraw increasingly from key functions. This leads to far-reaching changes also at Volkswagen. The British military government hands over trusteeship to the federal German government. The responsibility for the control of the company thereby passes to the state of Lower Saxony, with the proviso that such control must be jointly exercised in future. The arrangements are complex. Nevertheless, it leaves the issue of the legal ownership of the company Volkswagenwerk GmbH unanswered.
The company stayed under the British board until the autumn of 1949, when Charles Ratcliffe and Professor Erhard did a handover ceremony.
The official ceremony is held on the 8th of October 1949 in Bonn. Colonel Charles Ratcliffe, Germany's Minister of Economic Affairs Ludwig Erhard, and the senior Lower Saxony official Edgar Haverbeck all signed the document that places Volkswagenwerk GmbH in German hands.
I stayed until late summer of '49, that is some 20 months of Nordhaus time, sitting on the back seat, not in the driving seat, because we'd had top management in, and we weren't quite sure that Nordhaus was going to prove. And there was a modern factory ready to go with a labour force, with a management, with a product that was reasonably proven by this time and the bugs ironed out. And when the currency changed, it took off. That's when Volkswagen began to spread around the world.